Good day to you. This sermon recap will be a bit different. This sermon recap will actually be a combined recap. I'm going to try to weave together the three sermons, December 23rd, Advent 4, December 24th, Christmas Eve at University Lutheran, and yesterday's, or the first Sunday after Christmas, December 30th, all three sermons in kind of one continuous intertwined narrative here. So, back to the 23rd. Kind of an informal sitting on a stool sermon that began with, as Advent culminated in the song of Mary's, the Magnificat, as she comes to be with Elizabeth and finds Elizabeth also pregnant with John, who would be John the Baptizer, that Mary sings this song and sings this wonderfully ancient promised song. But then in the midst of it, in terms of the tense of the verbs and the way that she sings the song, that she sings herself into the promise. That she sings the song in such a way as to find herself in the promise, the long-awaited promise, the long-fulfilled promise of God already done, and yet in a new way in her, literally, and in her life, and she in this God. And so, sitting on the stool there the day before Christmas Eve, to say that we sing ourselves into the song. That we sing ourselves into the song in the midst of difficult things in life, this being shortly after the shootings in Connecticut, that we sing our songs even in the singing of O Come, Emmanuel, that we sing ourselves into an ancient song. It's probably one of my favorite, it is my favorite Advent hymn, but if push come to shove, it might be one of my favorite hymns of all time, because our daughters and my daughters and me, would sing it around the Advent wreath, and to have them sing themselves into an ancient longing, an ancient promise to the people of Israel that their God will come and lift them up and bring them home from exile, and that we sing ourselves into that song, that we sing ourselves into the song as a people of God, as a congregation. And this congregation just celebrated with Linnell and me our wedding the week before the 16th, that we as a people of God are called together to sing ourselves into a song with one with the other, that very seldom, you could make the argument never, does God call anyone, any single person, into a call, into faith. God calls us always into with one another. And so in singing this song of Advent, singing this song of Christmas, that we are sung into a people of God. That in a personal way, in the weeks during and after Anna's jaw surgery, my 19-year-old daughter had some jaw surgery, that we sing ourselves into a song. It is a song that we get to whisper into the ear of someone recovering from surgery, but even in our whispering that song into their ear, or singing that song to them, that we find hope for ourselves. We find faith for ourselves, that as we sing hope to another, that hope comes back around to us, that we hear ourselves in our own song, into the song that is faith and hope. And then, again, in an extremely personal way, kind of an upside-down pyramid, a great, singing ourselves into a great people, a long history, and then a congregation, and then with my daughter Anna, and then in this promise that is a covenant of marriage. There is a way that that covenant really is not about two people, nor is it simply about two people and 7 children. It is a promise bore up, lifted up, carried on the hopes and the promises and the shoulders of a people together. And so kind of an hourglass immediately, that promise of two people is found in the context of an ancient promise, that in Advent all our promises, all our covenants are gathered up into the one promise that is God's, into the one fulfillment that is God's in Christ. And so on that day before Christmas Eve, kind of a gathering up in a song, singing a song in a way that we find ourselves sung right into the long promise of God. Christmas Eve, I began with a couple of stanzas from a poem by Denise Levertov, Levertov. It's called Annunciation. You can find it online. But just a couple of the last lines. Called to a destiny more momentous than any in all of time, she did not quail, only asked a simple, "How can this be?" and gravely, courteously took to heart the angel's reply, perceiving instantly the astounding ministry she was offered: to bear in her womb infinite weight and lightness, to carry in hidden, finite inwardness 9 months of eternity, to contain in slender vase of being the sum of power, in narrow flesh the sum of light. Then bring to birth, push out into air, a man-child needing like any other milk and love, but who was God. This sermon, Christmas Eve, was kind of a sermon that came full circle for me. That last Good Friday, I get to preach with the Newman Catholic Parish to joint worship service, and I wondered of Judas's kiss. That we start with this sense of Judas's kiss, and I just had this idea: did Christ kiss Judas back, or how would Christ kiss Judas back? In betrayal, in anger, in revenge, or of course in love, in forgiveness. And so then, with this great cross hanging in the sanctuary before us, in the adoration of the cross that is Good Friday for us as a joint service, that I continue to repeat this refrain: it seemed all the world to be a kiss. Our touching the cross seems all the world to be a kiss. The cross itself seems all the world to be a kiss. And so, coming full circle in this sermon, that in the incarnation of Jesus as the fulfillment of this long-awaited promise of God, a song that we sing ourselves into, in this beautiful poem of Mary, being, in the ancient language, God-bearer, Theotokos, the one who bears up God, and this image of this mother, this parent, holding her child and kissing Jesus as an infant, turning that just one step back and to hear and to see and to know the incarnation and Christmas, the promise of Christmas, as a first kiss of God. That the good news, that the angels singing and the shepherds coming seems all the world to be a kiss from our side of life, from our side of worship, to kiss and to adore the infant Jesus, the baby Jesus come born on this holy night. But really the angels, the heavenly hosts, come and sing good news. Blessed are you, Mary. Gabriel's talking to Mary, his speaking to her, that it seems all the world, before we even get around to adoring the Christ, it seems all the world to be a kiss that this Jesus is born, that this God takes up a place in the promise too, that this God sings God's self into the promise, long awaited for by us, long spoken ago by God, and God takes up a place in the promise that is Christ, and it seems all the world to be a kiss. And so now on to tomorrow, and the sermons weren't meant to be a continuation of one of the other, but it makes sense to do it this way for this recap. And so then to talk about Jesus in the first Sunday after Christmas in Luke, we get Luke chapter 2, and Jesus is already 12 years old. And so kind of wrestling with the angst that Christmas is just done. Christmas feels over. Somebody says nothing is over so much as when Christmas is over. It just hits us heavy and hard, and then we have a stale Christmas tree that's too big and seems too oddly in place in our living rooms, and there's bits of wrapping paper strewn all about our homes. We find them sticking to our socks in the weeks to come. That nothing is over so much as when Christmas is over, and yet the church, Christmas is not done. In fact, literally, exactly, Christmas has just begun. This is the first Sunday after Christmas. It's the Sunday of Christmas. And yet we get this 12-year-old Jesus going to Jerusalem with his parents to celebrate Passover, and you know the story. They lose him on the way back in the midst of all these travelers. And Jesus, after 3 days, they come find him, and Jesus is in the temple, and he says kind of, it seems to us kind of smart mouth, says, you know, why did you wonder where I was at? Didn't you know that I was to be in my Father's house? That Luke wants us to know that Jesus comes in the ordinary chaos of who we are. Some other Gospels give us some, that didn't make the canon, didn't make the Bible, give us these extraordinary stories of Jesus as a boy, even as an infant when Mary and Joseph go to Egypt to flee from Herod. There are some other Gospels that say the baby Jesus made the animals along the way, camels and donkeys and asses, bow down to Mary and Joseph, all those kinds of things, which would seem to us in this first Sunday after Christmas like it would be consistent with who Luke gives us as Jesus to be born, with angels and shepherds and all the fanfare. The text right before where our gospel comes from the first Sunday after Christmas is Jesus 8 days old, being circumcised and named. And Simeon comes forward and says, "Now let your servant depart in peace. I've seen the salvation promised by God to all people." And Anna comes. And so in Luke's thrust that this Jesus is not just for Israel, but for all the world. That was just verses before we began our gospel for yesterday, and now yet Jesus is 12 years old. One commentator said that the definition of mercy is to enter into someone else's chaos, is to enter into another's chaos, and Jesus enters into our chaos in the Gospel of Luke ordinarily. Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, 3 days lost. A couple things about that. One, that we in that proclamation, in that realization of our own chaos, we have a sense that we belong. When all the world in its chaos, in its suffering, wants to isolate us and make us a statistic or to play us over and against another, to differentiate us in the chaos that is ordinary life, in the church, we are gathered together as we belong. But the second piece of that is that we belong, going back to Advent 2, that we belong to the long-awaited promise and proclamation that Zechariah says that when God comes, when God fulfills, here now that Jesus is here in the ordinary chaos of us and our lives and the people of God going to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, 3 days lost in this crowd, that we belong also to the way that is God's, which is mercy and peace and forgiveness. So one little scripture, the second lesson was from Colossians, but I wanted to read it from a translation by N.T. Wright. "These are the clothes that you must put on, that then, since God has chosen you, made you holy and lavished his love upon you. You must be tender-hearted, kind, humble, meek, and ready to put up with anything. You must bear with one another, and if another has a complaint against someone else, you must forgive each other. Just as the Master forgave you, you must also do the same. On top of all this, you must put on love, which ties everything together and makes it complete. Let the King's peace be the deciding factor in your hearts. That's what you're called to, within one body, and be thankful." What struck me about that is let the King's peace be the deciding factor. In the midst of all the things, all the factors that we try to take into account as we decide our own behavior, as we decide our own attitude, as we decide our own self-preservation of being defensive or angry or revenge, all those things, Paul says in Colossians, in N.T. Wright's translation, is let this be the deciding factor. All other things considered, let this be the deciding factor. Let the King's peace, Jesus' peace, mercy, forgiveness that was proclaimed in Zechariah's song, let that be the deciding factor of who we are as a people of God. All the world knows that this creation could use some peace and some forgiveness and some mercy and some kindness. You as the people of God, let this be the deciding factor. Not the chaos of the world or even within ourselves, but let the King's peace, let the King's forgiveness, let the King's mercy be the deciding factor in your life and how you're going to treat another. And so in these days of picking up a newspaper or watching some world news or watching the local news, as a child of God, a disciple of Jesus Christ, go and be light. Go and do something. Be light. Let this be the deciding factor in your life. The King's peace, the King's light, the King's mercy, the King's forgiveness, and go and do likewise. Take up a place with this Christ who has taken up a place ordinarily with you. Grace and peace be with you.